June, 1590. From the main tower of Oshi Castle, the eyes of the warrior Princess Kaihime sweep across an ocean of steel and banners. 23,000 soldiers of the Toyotomi clan, the army unifying Japan under a single lord, have arrived to engulf her home. They are a human tide, a force of nature whose very presence should have pulverized all hope. Inside the walls at her side stands a garrison that is but a single drop against that flood. 619 samurai and 2,000 hastily recruited peasants, armed more with courage than with proper equipment. The disparity in forces is not a tactical disadvantage. It is a death sentence written on the horizon, waiting to be executed. But Kaihime's gaze does not linger on the anonymous faces of the invaders or the tips of their countless spears. Her eyes fix beyond them, on the landscape surrounding the castle, an intricate network of swamps, flooded rice paddies, and serpentine rivers. To an outsider, this terrain is a mere obstacle, an inconvenience. But for Kaihime and the defenders, it is their greatest ally, the key to their survival. She does not see a quagmire, but a moat designed by the gods, a natural barrier that will drown any conventional assault and turn their fortress into an impregnable island. It is there, in the embrace of water and mud, that their one desperate hope of resisting the inevitable resides. The Toyotomi commanders, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, see Oshi Castle as a simple formality, the last piece of a regional puzzle about to be completed. They cannot imagine that this small bastion, defended by a handful of warriors and farmers, will become a thorn in their campaign's side. They do not know that the woman watching them from the tower is not a damsel awaiting her fate, but a predator assessing her hunting ground. The odds are not daunting. They are impossible. Yet in the minds of the defenders, the question is not if they will die, but how. Many of their enemies they will take with them. The battle for Oshi Castle is about to begin, and it will become the stuff of legend. The army that spread before Oshi Castle was the embodiment of a new era. 23,000 men, veterans forged in the crucible of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's wars of unification, formed a glacier of steel and gunpowder sliding inexorably across Japan. This was no disorganized horde. It was a modern war machine, disciplined and equipped with the finest military technology of the age. Every soldier, every unit, moved with the precision of a perfectly oiled mechanism, having brought much more formidable castles than Oshi to heel. Their reputation preceded them like thunder before a storm. They represented the overwhelming power of a centralized government, a force of nature destined to erase the last vestiges of feudal independence. They were Hideyoshi's iron fist, and their purpose was not simply to conquer, but to crush and assimilate. Commanding this colossal force was Ishida Mitsunari, a figure of both brilliance and profound insecurity. As an administrator, he was a genius, an architect of the bureaucracy and logistics that sustained Hideyoshi's regime. His mind was sharp, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient in the halls of power. On the battlefield, however, his record was a blank page. This absence of martial glory was an open wound in his pride, a deficiency that consumed him in a world where military valor was the ultimate currency. The siege of Oshi was not, for him, a simple military operation. It was his golden opportunity to prove to his lord and to himself that he was more than a bureaucrat. He craved a swift, spectacular victory that would elevate him into the pantheon of great generals. This desperate ambition was the mother of his arrogance. Mitsunari looked upon the small castle and its garrison of samurai and peasants with a barely concealed disdain. In his mind, victory was already assured. The only question was how gloriously he could orchestrate it. Blinded by his desire to emulate his master's exploits, he fatally underestimated his adversary. He failed to see the determination in their eyes, failed to respect their profound knowledge of the terrain, and above all, failed to understand that war is not merely an exercise in numbers and logistics. He believed his superior intellect was a sufficient weapon to overcome any obstacle, a catastrophic assumption that would lead him to make one of the most disastrous decisions of his career, turning the stage of his expected glory into a monument to his failure. In stark contrast to the anonymous war machine of the Toyotomi, the defense of Oshi Castle had a human face, forged in desperation and duty. At the head of the garrison was Narita Nagachika, the acting castellan, a man upon whose shoulders rested the unbearable weight of his clan's destiny. He was not a legendary warlord seeking glory on the battlefield, but a guardian, a protector, entrusted with an impossible task. Every decision he made was colored by the knowledge that one mistake would mean not only his death, but the annihilation of his people and the erasure of his family's name from history. His resolve was not born of ambition, but of the purest and heaviest of burdens, the obligation to honor his ancestors and protect their legacy to his very last breath. But if Nagachika was the anchor of the resistance, his niece Kaihime was the flame that ignited their hearts. A fierce Onimusha, a female warrior whose defiant spirit refused to be intimidated by the enemy's size. Her presence on the walls was a weapon in itself, a living declaration that Oshi Castle would not surrender without leaving a bloody scar upon the memory of its aggressors. Kaihime was not just a skilled combatant, she was the embodiment of the castle's indomitable spirit, a force of nature that mirrored the tenacity of the land that surrounded them. Her courage transformed simple peasants into lions, reminding them that even the smallest hunter can bring down a beast if it fights with the cunning and ferocity born from defending its home. This spirit was the soul of an army that, on paper, was a joke. 619 samurai, the professional core of the defense, were supplemented by 2,000 local recruits. These were not soldiers, but farmers, artisans, and merchants who had been handed a spear. Their equipment was a mosaic of old armor, repurposed farming, tools, and an iron will. Yet their weakness was also their greatest strength. Unlike the invaders, they were not fighting for a distant lord or the promise of spoils. They fought for the fields they had tilled, the homes they had built, the families sheltering behind the walls. Every corner of the swamp, every hidden path, every current of the river was etched into their memory. They were not an occupying force. They were the land itself, risen in arms. Their cause was as desperate as it was noble. As vassals of the Hojo clan, the Narita were part of the last great obstacle standing in the way of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's total unification of Japan. The great siege of the main castle at Odawara was underway, and Oshi's fall was considered a minor but necessary step in subjugating the region. For the defenders, therefore, this battle was more than the survival of a single castle. It was an act of loyalty to their lords and a defense of their very identity against the homogenizing tide of the new regime. They clung to their clan's honor as a drowning man clings to driftwood in a storm, turning their inevitable sacrifice into a legendary act of defiance. A handful of souls against an empire. The stage is set, and the stakes could not be higher. Total annihilation or a defense that will echo through the centuries. These are the stories we refuse to let fade into the dust of time, the legends of impossible courage that define the human spirit. If the determination of Kaihime and the defenders of Oshi has already ignited a spark within you, if you believe that intelligence and knowledge of the land can indeed stand against brute force, then we ask you to make your mark on this digital battlefield. Show your support with a like, and subscribe to our channel to join our legion. Every subscription is a vote for the memory of these forgotten heroes. Now, let us return to the walls of Oshi, for the giant's fatal error was about to be revealed. The secret hope of Oshi's defenders was not a legendary sword or impenetrable armor. It was a far more subtle and lethal weapon, a deep understanding of the enemy's psychology. From the outside, the decision to resist seemed an act of collective suicide, an irrational defiance against an overwhelming force. For Narita Nagachika and Kaihime, however, it was a calculated chess move. They knew they could not win a battle of attrition or a frontal assault. Their only chance lay in not playing the game their enemy expected. By refusing to surrender, they were not just defending their honor. They were casting an irresistible bait, gambling everything on their opponent's arrogance being his undoing. They were transforming the physical battlefield into a mental labyrinth from which Ishida Mitsunari could not escape. The target of this psychological strategy was one man, Ishida Mitsunari. The Narita knew his reputation. They knew he was a brilliant administrator, but an untested commander, desperate to earn the military respect of his lord, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. A conventional victory, a bloody, protracted slaughter in the swamps, would not bring him the glory he craved. It would only cast him as an inefficient butcher. He needed a victory that was a work of art, a stroke of tactical genius that would resonate across Japan and prove his superior intellect. The defenders were counting on this ego, on this need to impress. They denied him the easy battle he expected, forcing him to seek a grander, more complex solution, and therefore, one far more prone to catastrophic error. His ambition was the true minefield. This manipulation was only possible thanks to the third combatant on the field, the terrain itself. Oshi Castle was not a stone fortress on an imposing hill. It was a bastion of earth and wood intertwined with its aquatic environment. The surrounding swamps were its true outer wall. Any large-scale infantry assault would be forced to advance slowly, waist-deep in water and mud, breaking ranks and becoming easy targets for the archers on the walls. Such an attack would be a drain on men and morale, a spectacle of incompetence. The Narita knew that Mitsunari, upon assessing the situation, would see this quagmire and dismiss it. The terrain not only protected them, but it actively guided their enemy's mind toward riskier, more desperate options, which is exactly what they wanted. Thus, the genius of Oshi's defense is revealed not in a single action, but in the perfect synchronization of their defiance, their terrain, and their enemy's personality. The refusal to surrender was the first move, a declaration that forced Mitsunari to act. The swampy ground was the second, making the most obvious action, a direct assault, extremely costly and undesirable for a commander hungry for glory. This created a tactical vacuum, a need for an elegant solution, and it was in that vacuum that the trap lay. The defenders gambled that, rather than a long and tedious ground siege, Mitsunari would seek to master the very element that defined the castle, the water. They were, in essence, inviting him to make the fatal mistake of believing he could control nature better than they could. The vast encampment of the Toyotomi army was a city of canvas and steel, buzzing with a confidence that bordered on contempt. To these 23,000 veterans, the refusal to surrender was not an act of bravery, but a peasant insolence that was merely delaying the inevitable. The air smelled of cook fires, and sake and laughter echoed between tents as soldiers gambled or shared stories of sieges against far more impressive castles. Armor was polished without urgency, weapons sharpened by routine, not imminent need. From his command pavilion, Ishida Mitsunari viewed the castle not as a fortress, but as a logistical problem to be solved. For him and his men, the battle had not yet begun. They were simply waiting for the enemy to comprehend the futility of their existence and step aside. Atmosphere was not one of pre-combat tension, but of overwhelming, impatient certainty. Within the walls of Oshi, the air was thick, charged with an entirely different kind of silence. It was a heavy silence, forged in unity and shared resolve. On the ramparts, sentries did not speak. Their eyes were fixed on the sea of enemy banners, their hands gripping bows and spears. Every defender, whether a samurai in ancestral armor or a farmer with a makeshift yari, knew their post and the person beside them. Kaihime and Narita Nagachika moved among them, not with grand speeches, but with knowing glances and gestures of encouragement that were worth 1,000 words. Fear, no doubt, coiled in the stomachs of many, but it was held at bay by a greater purpose, the defense of their homes. There was no room for arrogance or despair, only a grim determination, a collective acceptance that the morning would bring blood. At dawn on the day of the first assault, an unnatural calm settled over the landscape. Fog crept lazily over the swamps, shrouding the castle's base and muffling all sound. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. From Oshi's towers, the enemy camp looked like a slumbering beast, its flickering campfires the last dying embers of its eyes. For the besiegers, it was the silence that precedes an execution. For the defenders, it was the last deep breath before plunging into deep, turbulent waters. This was not peace, but the tense equilibrium between two forces, about to collide, the stillness in the eye of a hurricane that was about to unleash unimaginable violence upon that small island of defiance. The time for words was over. The response to their defiance was not long in coming. To the sound of war drums beating like the heart of a giant, the first wave of the Toyotomi army moved forward. It was a tide of thousands of Ashigaru, a wall of spears and banners advancing with terrifying discipline across the open ground. Their objective was simple: to crush the small garrison under the weight of their numbers, take the outer walls, and stamp out the rebellion in a matter of hours. From the battlements, the defenders watched the enemy line approach, a 1,000-headed monster devouring the land. But then, the creature met the mud. The disciplined advance devolved into a clumsy, desperate struggle against a ground that refused to let them go, a hungry swamp that clung to every sandal and every leg with a deathly tenacity. It was at that precise moment that hell was unleashed from the walls. With the enemy bogged down and disorganized, turned into a confused mass of men fighting the terrain more than each other, Oshi's archers found their paradise. Under Kaihime's command, a black rain of arrows fell upon them with lethal precision. It was not a random volley, but a methodical execution. Each arrow found its mark in an exposed enemy, unable to maneuver or properly shield himself. Cries of war transformed into shrieks of pain as soldiers fell, drowning in the muddy water. The battlefield had become a death trap, where the attackers' overwhelming numbers turned against them, creating a human bottleneck that only served to offer more targets to the defenders. The retreat was as chaotic and humiliating as the advance had been arrogant. The Toyotomi troops fell back, leaving behind hundreds of their comrades whose bodies lay half submerged in the blood-reddened mire. The first assault had not just been repelled, it had been a one-sided slaughter. For the defenders, it was a bloody confirmation that their strategy was sound. Their land fought alongside them. For Ishida Mitsunari, it was a public slap in the face, an unbearable wound to his ego. He realized, with a rising fury, that a direct assault was a recipe for disaster, a slow bleeding of his army at the hands of an enemy they could barely reach. The path of brute force was closed. He had to find another way, a grander solution that would erase the stain of this initial humiliation. Frustrated, furious, and under immense pressure to deliver a victory worthy of his lord, Ishida Mitsunari abandoned the tactics of brute force and embraced those of twisted ingenuity. The order, reputedly suggested by Hideyoshi himself, was both audacious and monumental. If he could not take the castle by force, he would drown it. Thus began the campaign's most colossal act of hubris, the construction of a gigantic dike, a 28-kilometer serpent of earth and stone, designed to contain the waters of the nearby Tone River and unleash them upon the fortress. Thousands of local peasants were forcibly conscripted, working day and night under the lash of Mitsunari's overseers. The scale of the project was pharaonic, a testament to the power of the Toyotomi regime, capable of reshaping the very landscape to crush a single insignificant castle. In just 7 days, a feat of astonishing and brutal engineering, the monstrous earthen wall was complete. The structure rose like a monument to one man's impatience, an artificial scar imposed upon nature. With the dike finished, the sluice gates were closed, and the river began to swell, its waters seeking an outlet, a victim. Slowly at first, then with gathering force, the water overflowed, covering the rice paddies and swamps, expanding until it created a vast artificial lake where there was once dry land. From the walls, the defenders watched in silence as the world around them was submerged, as the terrain that had been their salvation disappeared beneath a dark and threatening sheet of water. For Mitsunari's men, it was a spectacle of divine power, the culmination of their master plan. Oshi Castle, true to its nickname, became an island. Surrounded on all sides by an impassable moat, the fortress now stood defiant in the middle of the rising waters. The floating castle was born, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a tangible, terrifying reality. For Mitsunari, this was the moment of checkmate. He had neutralized the defenders' advantage of the swampy terrain and isolated them completely. He believed it was now only a matter of time before desperation and a lack of supplies forced them to their knees. He gazed upon his handiwork, the artificial lake he had created, and saw the reflection of his own brilliance. He could not have known that in attempting to control nature, he had merely unleashed a force he did not understand, one that would soon turn against him with implacable fury. The water rose, and with it, Ishida Mitsunari's ego reached its zenith. He beheld his tactical masterpiece, an artificial lake surrounding his prey, a liquid cage from which there was no escape. Oshi Castle was now, in effect, the floating castle. Yet, as the days turned into a week, an unsettling truth began to surface from the depths of his lake. To his growing horror, the castle was not sinking. Built on a natural rise, a topographical detail his arrogance had deemed insignificant. The fortress remained defiantly above the waterline. The water lapped at the base of its walls but refused to climb higher, unable to reach the heart of the fortress. His ultimate siege weapon was not working as he had intended. The revelation crashed against Mitsunari with the force of a tidal wave. The colossal moat he had built with the sweat of thousands was not a death trap for the defenders. It had become their salvation. He had created with his own hands the most formidable defensive barrier the hour Narita could have ever dreamed of, a moat so wide and deep that any attempt at an amphibious assault would be suicide. His own troops were now stranded on the shore, staring helplessly at the enemy they had come to annihilate. The irony was as crushing as the water itself. His most sophisticated weapon had disarmed his own army. The tactical genius had outsmarted himself, transforming his battlefield into a prison of his own incompetence. Inside the walls, the shift in morale was seismic. The strain of survival was replaced by a surge of fierce, exultant hope. The defenders watched from their high ground, seeing the frustration and confusion spread through the enemy camp like a plague. Their faith in their home, in the wisdom of their ancestors who had chosen this precise spot to build, had been validated in the most spectacular fashion. The water, which was meant to be their tomb, had become their guardian. The floating castle was no longer a name for a besieged fortress. It was a banner of defiance, a symbol of their unyielding spirit that refused to be sunk. The tide of battle, both literally and figuratively, had begun to turn. But nature, which Mitsunari had tried to subdue, had its own verdict to render. The rainy season arrived with an implacable fury, unleashing torrential downpours that seemed determined to wash the landscape away. Day after day, the heavens opened, and the vast artificial reservoir created by the dike began to swell like a dying animal. The water level rose at an alarming rate, far exceeding the calculations of Mitsunari's engineers. The gigantic dike, built with haste and hubris, began to groan under a pressure it was never designed to withstand. Leaks appeared, the earth softened, and the structure that represented Mitsunari's genius revealed itself to be a water bomb on the verge of detonating, a threat far greater to his own troops than to the castle he meant to drown. Panic began to spread silently among the besiegers. As fear gripped the besiegers, audacity was born in the besieged. Seeing their greatest opportunity in nature's chaos, a small, daring group of defenders prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives. Under the cover of the darkest night and the veil of a deafening rain that masked all sound, they slipped out of the castle. Moving like ghosts through waters they knew like the back of their hands, they reached the most vulnerable sections of the dike. With water up to their chests and their hearts in their throats, they began to dig to dismantle their enemy's creation. It was not an act of blind vandalism. It was an act of reverse engineering, a calculated release of pressure at the precise point where it would cause the most damage, not to them, but to their oppressors. First, there was a tremor, then a dull roar that swelled into a thunderous crash. The earthen wall, weakened by the rain and sabotaged from within, gave way. A wall of water, mud, and debris, freed from its artificial prison, surged with uncontrollable violence, not towards the castle but backwards, directly upon the main camp of the Toyotomi army. The waves swept away tents, armor, and men alike, transforming an organized military camp into a churning vortex of death and destruction in seconds. Hundreds of soldiers were carried off by the current or drowned in the mud, victims of the very weapon their commander had created. Ishida Mitsunari's brilliant strategy had turned on him in the most spectacular and humiliating way imaginable. The torrent of water did not just sweep away the camp, it annihilated Ishida Mitsunari's authority. In the chaos that followed, as survivors struggled out of the mire that was swallowing their comrades, eyes no longer turned to their commander for orders, but with a mixture of terror and accusation. The architect of their misfortune stood there, in his pavilion, watching his masterpiece become a mass grave for his own men. Discipline, the pillar of the Toyotomi army, fractured instantly. They were no longer a conquering force, but a terrified and disoriented mob, trapped in a swamp of their own making. The army's spine was broken not by a cavalry charge or a breach in the wall, but by the torrent of muddy water that erupted from one man's arrogance. News of the disaster spread faster than the floodwaters. The stories, no doubt exaggerated by panic and humiliation, flew from unit to unit. The great strategist had drowned his own troops. The castle still stood, mocking them from its man-made island. Morale utterly collapsed. An army that had considered itself invincible now felt like the laughingstock of all Japan. The samurai, whose loyalty was built on respect as much as fear, looked at Mitsunari with barely concealed contempt. How could they follow a man who had been so spectacularly outwitted by a handful of defenders and the weather? The collapse was not just tactical, but fundamentally psychological. Faith in leadership, the glue that holds any army together, dissolved in the muddy water, leaving only frightened and resentful individuals. The transition from a disciplined army to a panicked crowd was brutal and final. The siege, for all practical purposes, was over. Though the Toyotomi forces still massively outnumbered the defenders, they had lost the will to fight. The camp became a quagmire of despair, where efforts were focused on recovering bodies and salvaging equipment, not on planning the next assault. Ishida Mitsunari was left isolated, a pathetic figure surrounded by the wreckage of his ambition. His brilliant plan had not only failed, but it had become his enemy's most effective weapon. The floating castle had not needed to fire a single arrow to inflict this mortal wound. It had simply waited for its adversary's arrogance to drown in its own genius. The battle was over, not by the force of arms, but by the crushing weight of humiliation. When the sun finally dared to rise, it illuminated, not a battlefield, but a mire of desolation. The air, once charged with the tension of combat, now stank of mud, death, and an oppressive humidity. The silence that had settled was heavier than any war cry, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the buzz of insects already beginning to claim the fallen. The once proud camp of the Toyotomi army was now a liquid graveyard, with broken banners and empty armor sinking slowly into the sludge. In the midst of this self-inflicted ruin, Oshi Castle stood untouched, serene, not as a fortress that had survived a siege, but as a silent monument, judging the madness that spread at its feet. The carnage was over, leaving an indelible scar on the land and on one man's reputation. The final tally of the battle was an indictment written in blood. Though the exact figures have been lost to the fog of history, the chronicles agree that Ishida Mitsunari's forces suffered hundreds of casualties. The most humiliating part was not the number, but the cause. Most of his men did not die by the sword or the arrow, but were drowned by their own commander's weapon, swept away by a torrent that was meant to be their instrument of victory. In stark contrast, losses among the defenders were astonishingly light. They had repelled a force nearly 40 times their size, not through bloody battle, but through patience, intelligence, and an unshakable faith in their home. The casualty ratio did not speak of a victory, it spoke of a one-sided, self-inflicted annihilation, a tactical disaster of legendary proportions. Yet the final fate of Oshi Castle would not be decided on its rain-soaked walls. Despite their heroic and successful defense, the war was being won and lost on a much larger stage. The final blow came not from a spear or a cannon, but from a messenger bearing devastating news. Odawara Castle, the main fortress of the Hojo clan and the heart of the resistance, had surrendered to the overwhelming power of Toyotomi, Hideyoshi. With their overlord defeated, the Narita's cause had vanished. Fulfilling their feudal duty, Narita Nagachika surrendered the castle. The gates of Oshi were opened, not by the force of an invading army, but by loyalty to a fallen lord. The floating castle was never conquered. It simply accepted its place in a Japan that had already changed forever. The deepest, most lasting echo of the siege of Oshi resonated not in the halls of a castle, but in the soul of one man, Ishida Mitsunari's. Humiliation was absolute and, most importantly, public. The story of how a brilliant administrator was outwitted by a handful of recruits, and the reign became a venomous anecdote, a brand of incompetence that clung to him like a second skin. This reputation would haunt him mercilessly for the next decade. In the volatile political climate that followed Hideyoshi's death, trust and martial prowess were the coin of the realm. Mitsunari, stained by the failure at Oshi, struggled to win the Iei's unconditional support of other great warlords who secretly doubted his ability to lead on the battlefield. The shadow of Oshi stretched all the way to the plains of Sekigahara, where that very same mistrust among his allies would become a fatal factor in the battle that decided the fate of Japan. While one man's reputation sank into the mud, a castle's rose to immortality. The siege of Oshi transcended military history to become one of Japan's most beloved legends of resistance. The story of the floating castle, the fortress that refused to be sunk by the power of an empire, became etched into the national consciousness as the ultimate archetype of the Japanese David versus Goliath. It became a powerful symbol that cunning, intimate knowledge of the land and an unbreakable spirit could, indeed, triumph over brute force and limitless resources. The legacy of Kaihime and her defenders was not a territorial victory, but something far more enduring, a wellspring of inspiration that proved that a nation's true strength lies not in its great armies, but in the resolve of ordinary people who refuse to kneel. Armies depart, castles fall to ruin, and the names of great lords fade into the pages of history. But sometimes, arrogance leaves a scar so deep that not even time can erase it. If one travels today to the old province of Musashi, one can walk upon Ishida Mitsunari's most enduring legacy. It is not a statue or a temple, but a long, winding hill of earth that snakes. Through the rice fields, known locally as the Ishida Tsutsumi, the Ishida Dike, this modest, grass-covered rise is all that remains of the monumental weapon that was meant to bring him glory. The dike, his masterpiece of engineering, his instrument of absolute power, became the eternal epitaph of his failure, an unintentional monument to his own colossal humiliation. This scar on the landscape is the legend's final guardian, a silent storyteller that tells the tale better than any chronicle. Every meter of that earth is a reminder that nature cannot be shackled, and that the spirit of a people defending their home is a force more powerful than any army. The dike speaks not of Ishida Mitsunari's strength, but of the resilience of Kaihime and the 600 samurai who refused to yield. It is the physical, permanent proof of how the floating castle was never sunk, and of how a handful of heroes, armed with a profound knowledge of their land, turned their enemy's greatest weapon into the cause of his spectacular downfall, letting the land itself tell their story forever.